I found your piece about the most important question facing whoever wins the Democratic primary to be really one that's really on point. Of course, this assumes that the Democrats are able, regardless of who the primary winner is, to beat Donald Trump and presumably at least hold the House.
Right.
And this is, and you know, anything can happen. I think we learned that in 2016. We also learned it in 2018, frankly, which was a 100-year high turnout for midterm election, with the Democrats winning in a record-breaking way in midterms elections. But of course, the Senate is just structurally problematic for the Democrats to take, and who knows with Donald Trump. But you start with that assumption, which I think is a fair assumption. But then you say, really, we have some major problems to deal with. And then you get into sort of two different options of how to deal with that. But let's just walk through what will still remain, even if Donald Trump is ushered out of office, even frankly, if they put handcuffs on him as he walks out. But regardless of his fate, what of the fate of our government and our country?
Right. So, I mean, let's start with like the most optimistic scenario for Democrats. So, like, Republicans are destroyed in the 2020 election. The Democratic president, Democratic House, and let's even give Democrats the Senate, which, given malapportionment, given the fact that Wyoming gets the same number of senators as California, is very, very hard to do. But let's say Democrats even manage to take the Senate. You're still going to have Mitch McConnell in there filibustering everything he can, and the possibility that Democrats are going to have 60 seats in the Senate is close to 0%. You're still going to have the Supreme Court sabotaging, virtually any major legislation that that the Congress passes. You're still going to have a Supreme Court that's going to strip away voting rights so that states can enact laws that make it even harder for Democrats to win future elections. And then one other thing that I didn't mention in my piece is that you're going to have a Supreme Court that's going to strip away the executive branch's power. So the president isn't going to be able to use existing statutes in order to govern.
Now, let's just go. I want to just go through a couple of those that just, and we should also say the assumption here is that either Clarence Thomas is still around, or even a worst case scenario in many respects, Clarence Thomas resigns, sometime in the next, 6 months or, 18 months, and is replaced with someone who is like Clarence Thomas, but 20 or 30 years younger, essentially.
Right.
And so that's going to be around.
Plenty of young Thomases that Trump could pick at this point.
And when you say inhibit executive branch power, you're talking about the likelihood that the Supreme Court, as it's made up now, could overturn things like the Chevron doctrine. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, Chevron is it's like a 30-year-old Supreme Court case, which says more or less that when agencies regulate, when they use the existing power that's been given to them by existing federal laws, courts should be very deferential to those agencies and should be reluctant to strike down what the agencies do on the ground that the agency has exceeded its power. And so you've already seen some signs that this Supreme Court isn't going to let Democrats use those powers in a robust way. One of Scalia's last acts while he was alive was to block President Obama's Clean Power Plan, and there wasn't really a good legal argument supporting that. There were just 5 Republican justices who didn't like the Clean Power Plan.
Right. Okay. So I just wanted to get that clear. So, okay. So that's the reality that we are looking at, regardless of what happens with the Senate. And then the question becomes, All right, how do you address this? And we should also say, this is not even addressing sort of like the politics on the ground, right? I mean, presumably, Donald Trump is gone, but all the people who voted for Donald Trump are still around. And so there's all these other facts, but you're talking specifically about the structural limitations that a Democratic president and even a Democratic Senate and House will have to actually not just fix what happened during the Trump years, but to stop what I guess a right-wing court system could do in the future. And so, okay, so what are the two options that we have?
Right. So, I mean, these are broad, like, philosophical options. So one playbook that Democrats could run off of, and if you've been watching, Speaker Pelosi closely, it's likely that she is following something very close to this playbook, is there's a really important book that came out shortly after the 2016 election called How Democracies Die by these two Harvard professors. And basically what they warned of is a kind of death spiral, where what happens is an illiberal party, a party that doesn't believe in liberal democracy gets into power. And so it starts violating a lot of the unwritten norms, things like when President Obama nominates Merrick Garland, you can't just not give him a hearing. Things like the Attorney General is supposed to represent the United States and not behave like the president's personal lawyer, norms like those. So an illiberal party gets into power, starts defying those norms. And eventually the opposition party sees this and they go, holy crap, like if they're going to behave this way, they're going to try to rig the system so we can't get into power again. So we need to escalate. We can't let ourselves be held back by norms. And then once that happens, the first party uses that as an excuse to continue escalating, and then that's the death spiral. And it doesn't end until you have authoritarian one-party rule. And so one playbook you can run is do not escalate. Just, cling to the norms that you have and hope that somehow the Republican Party's fever breaks at some point in the future, and then we can go back to being a normal democracy. And if you believe, and, there are some people, including Joe Biden, who have said that they believe this, that, eventually the Republican Party's fever is going to break, then, that's the playbook that makes sense. If you don't believe that, yeah, go ahead.
Well, all right, I just want to stay on this before we get to the break, and then when we come back from the break, we'll talk about the sort of the second option. But we should say that Pelosi seems to be functioning in this way. Schumer seems to be functioning in this way. We know that President Obama said the fever breaks. Joe Biden has more or less said the same thing, but literally right. President Obama said this. I think it was in the run up to the 2012 election, that the fever is going to break once they lose, and I get reelected, and then they're going to return back to some type of baseline. So this all is predicated on the notion that if we uphold the norms, the Republicans will too. And by we, I mean the Democratic Party from their perspective. So that's option one. Let's take a break here. When we come back, you'll tell us option two. And then we will. I may have some critique of option one, but we will. We'll wait until we get hear what option two is. On the other side, I'm talking to Ian Millhiser. We're talking about the most important question facing whomever wins the Democratic primary. I'm Sam Seder. This is Ring of Fire Radio.